In October of 2019, a buyer from a regional distributor named Harlan Voss stood in the tasting room of a shuttered cidery outside Schuyler County, New York, and made a note in his ledger. Estate inventory, no commercial value. Wild ferment stock, unsuitable for distribution. Casks, recommend scrapping. He capped his pen with a small, patient click and looked across the table at the young man who had inherited the place 3 months prior. "You understand what I'm telling you," Voss said. "This isn't a business. This is a sentimental situation." The young man's name was Amos Holt. He was 28 years old. He did not answer Voss directly. He looked at the row of old casks along the far wall of the cellar, each one marked in his grandfather's handwriting, and he said only that he appreciated Voss making the drive. 6 years later, in the autumn of 2025, Schuyler County Orchards and Cider could not fill its wholesale orders. The cidery ran dry each year by the first week of October, 6 weeks ahead of the holiday season. That year, the waiting list for a case of the estate reserve numbered 412 names. Harlan Voss was on it. This is the story of the 2 years between, and of what Amos Holt found in that shed. Let me tell you what the Holt place was before it fell apart. Amos's grandfather, Warren Holt, had started pressing cider in 1967 on 80 acres of mixed orchard in the low hills east of Watkins Glen. The orchard was old even then, planted in the 1910s by Warren's own father using varieties that nursery catalogs had already stopped listing: Spitzenberg, Golden Russet, Newtown Pippin, Foxwhelp, Kingston Black. These were not the apples that supermarkets wanted. They were small, misshapen, bitter sharp, and astringent in the hand, their flesh browning in minutes, their juice going cloudy before it settled. To anyone who walked that orchard in the 1960s thinking about commerce, the trees looked like a liability. To Warren Holt, who had grown up eating those apples off the ground as a boy, and had learned from his father the way the fruit from each row behaved in fermentation, they were the entire point. Warren pressed his first cider in a converted dairy barn. He used wild fermentation, meaning he did not add purchased yeast strains from a laboratory, but allowed the ambient yeasts already living in the orchard air and on the apple skins to drive the process. This was not, in 1967, considered a viable commercial method. The conventional wisdom from extension agents and the State Agricultural College was that wild fermentation was unreliable, inconsistent from year to year, impossible to predict, and likely to produce off flavors or failed batches. The recommended approach involved inoculating fresh juice with selected commercial yeast strains, controlling fermentation temperature precisely, adding sulfites to prevent contamination, and filtering the finished product to a clear, predictable, shelf-stable liquid. Warren read the extension pamphlets and set them aside. He had learned something from his father, and his father had learned it from his. And what they had learned was simple. The wild yeasts living in the air of this particular orchard, in this particular valley, at this particular elevation, had been shaping themselves to these particular apple varieties for 50 years. They were not random. They were place. The fermentation that resulted was not chaotic, but deeply characteristic, producing flavors that the commercial yeast strains could not approach because those strains had never tasted Watkins Glen in September, had never been kissed by the tannins of a Kingston Black, had never worked through the high-acid juice of a Spitzenberg after a frost. Warren Holt cured his cider in oak casks. He used old bourbon barrels he sourced from Kentucky, and old French oak barrels that had previously held wine, each one imparting a different character to whatever it held. He filled them in October and drew them in the following spring, sometimes the spring after that. sometimes longer. He kept a ledger recording what went in each cask, what the orchard had been that year, what the weather had done, and what, when he tasted a sample with a turkey baster through the bung, he thought the cider was doing. By the 1980s, he had a small, loyal following. He sold at the farm gate and through 2 or 3 local restaurants that understood what they were serving. He never grew. He never tried to. The orchard was what it was, and he made what it could make, and that was enough. Warren Holt died in the spring of 2019, at 81 years old, in debt. The cidery had not turned a profit in 11 years. His son, Amos's father, had moved to Albany in the 1990s and had no interest in the place. The property passed to Amos under a will that also attached $62,000 in outstanding agricultural loans, an orchard that had not been properly managed in 6 years, and a barn full of equipment that worked inconsistently at best. The casks, 41 of them in varying states of fullness, were considered by the estate's creditors to be without commercial value. There was no certification, no tasting notes on file with any distributor, no established accounts, no website. There was only the ledger, 61 pages of Warren Holt's handwriting, dating back to 1971, recording every pressing, every cask, every note, every draw. Amos Holt had grown up visiting that farm every summer as a boy. He remembered riding on the tractor with his grandfather, being handed apples off the branch and told their names. He had not been back in 8 years. He was working as a line cook in Rochester when his father called with the news about the will. He had no formal training in cider making, no certification in fermentation science, no business degree. He had the ledger and the casks and $62,000 of debt and a cidery that a regional distributor had just told him was a sentimental situation. If you have ever stood at the beginning of something that looks from the outside like an ending, you will understand something of what those first months were. Drop a comment if this kind of story lands for you, because we find a lot of people arrived at something the same way. Amos quit his job in Rochester in July of 2019. He loaded everything he owned into a second-hand pickup and drove south into Schuyler County on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving at the farmhouse in the last hour of daylight. The kitchen had not been open since the previous autumn. There were mouse droppings along the baseboard behind the stove, a ceiling stain from a winter leak over the bathroom, and a porch step that gave under his weight in a way that suggested the rot went deeper than the plank. The refrigerator held nothing but a jar of dry mustard that had belonged to his grandfather. He stood in the kitchen for a long moment looking at the jar. Then he set his bag on the table that Warren Holt had built from a white oak felled on the property in 1958, and he made himself a cup of instant coffee from supplies he had brought, and he sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the orchard until it was too dark to see. He moved into the farmhouse, which needed work, and spent the first 2 weeks simply walking the orchard, which needed more. Warren Holt had planted and maintained those trees across 5 decades, and they had been without real care since 2013, when his health had made the work impossible. Some of the older foxwhelp trees in the lower field had grown dense and tangled, their canopies collapsing inward in the way old apple trees do when they are not pruned, light-starved, the fruit small and bitter even by foxwhelp standards. The Newtown pippins on the east slope were healthier, as pippins generally are. The Kingston black trees, 12 of them in a single row along the stone wall, were doing what Kingston black trees do when ignored, producing heavy alternate-year crops of fruit that would fall to the ground in August and be lost. He walked the rows with the ledger in his hand, matching the trees to Warren's descriptions, learning the orchard, the way his grandfather had described it on paper. The ledger named not just varieties, but individual trees, their tendencies, their quirks. Tree 14 in the Kingston row had always run slightly earlier than the others. The third Spitzenberg from the north end of its row dropped heavy in frost years. Amos read and walked and read again. The casks were the more immediate question. Let me tell you what he found in that shed, because the shed is the center of this story. There were 41 casks in the cellar under the barn. Some were old bourbon barrels, American white oak, the insides still carrying the faint caramel and vanilla char of their previous life. Some were French oak, tighter grained, darker, having held Burgundy wine at some point before Warren acquired them at auction in the late 1970s. 3 were chestnut, which Warren had sourced from a cooperage in Vermont that had since closed, and which were unlike anything Amos had encountered. 29 of those casks contained cider. Some had been filled in October of 2018, one final pressing before Warren's strength had given out. Some held cider from 2016, from 2015. One cask, the ledger said, held cider pressed from the Kingston Black Row in October of 2014, nearly 5 years in oak. Harlan Voss had looked at those casks and seen spoilage risk and unknown inventory. He had not opened any of them. He had read their age and their provenance and their wild ferment origin, and applied the formula of his trade, which said that cider without proper yeast management and sulfite protection and filtration did not survive 5 years in a barrel. It became vinegar or worse, and no distributor would touch it. Amos opened them one by one with his grandfather's turkey baster, the same one Warren had used, its rubber bulb cracked along one seam, but still functional. He worked through November and December, drawing a small sample from each bung, tasting, writing notes of his own in the back pages of the ledger. He had no professional vocabulary for what he was tasting. He used the words he had. The 2014 Kingston Black he described in 4 words. Tastes like the stone wall smells in October. Dark, tight, long. He was not wrong. What Warren Holt had achieved, and what Amos was only beginning to understand, was grounded in a simple fact. Wild ferment cider from tannic heritage apple varieties, cured in seasoned oak over multiple years, does something that commercial cider cannot. The ambient yeasts work more slowly. They consume sugars the commercial strains would have left behind. The tannins from the Kingston Black and the Foxwhelp, which made those apples nearly inedible fresh, become an extended cask maturation, what tannins do in any long-cured beverage. They soften, integrate, bind with acids, produce compounds that no laboratory yeast working on Honeycrisp juice in a stainless steel tank at a controlled 62 degrees ever generates. You cannot rush it. You cannot replicate it with a different apple. You cannot speed it with a commercial yeast culture, because the commercial culture does not carry the specific wild organisms that have been shaping themselves to this orchard's particular microbial ecology since the 1970s. The cider in those casks was not spoiled, it was done. Amos Holt had $62,000 in debt, an orchard in disrepair, and 29 casks of some of the finest heritage variety cider in the Northeast. The problem was that no one knew it yet. He called his neighbor first. Donna Pruitt ran a small apple operation 2 miles down the road. She grew Cortland and McIntosh, the commercial varieties, and sold at a roadside stand. She was 53 and had known Amos since he was a child, and she said what she said out of kindness. "Amos, I know it matters to you, but you might want to think about what a realistic exit looks like." He thanked her and started pressing. The 2019 pressing was whatever the neglected orchard would give, which was not ideal. The Kingston Black Road dropped heavy that October, as they do in alternate years, and he caught the fruit himself, on his knees in the wet grass under the trees in the early morning, gathering what had already fallen and pulling what was ready from the branch. His grandfather's picker's bag was hanging on a nail in the barn. He put it on. His grandfather had worn it for 40 years, and the canvas was soft in a way that new fabric never is, shaped by 4 decades of the same motion, the reaching and the gathering and the turning and the drop. The Spitzenberg trees gave a reduced crop because they had not been pruned. But what the fruit lacked in volume, it made up in concentration, the way stressed trees often produce more intense fruit. He pressed 140 gallons through the old rack and cloth press, the same press Warren had used since the 1970s, its wooden frame dark with half a century of juice. The press leaked at 2 of its fittings. He had the fittings wrapped with plumber's tape by the end of the first day, and had lost perhaps 8 gallons to the barn floor, which he considered tuition. He filled 8 casks, each labeled in his own hand, each with a note in the ledger. He wrote the date, the variety, the cask type, and what the weather had been that October. Cool, with 2 nights of hard frost in the first week that had concentrated the sugars in the Kingston Black particularly. He wrote what he thought the fermentation smelled like at the bung on day 3, which was sharp and yeasty and faintly of apple blossom. He wrote that he was not certain of anything yet. Then he started moving the old inventory. He did not have a tasting room license yet. He did not have a retail permit. What he had was a stack of his grandfather's business cards, blanked on the back, and a willingness to drive. He contacted the 3 restaurants Warren had sold to in the 1980s and 1990s. 2 were closed. The third, a farmhouse-style restaurant in Ithaca called the Granger Table, was still operating under its original owner, a woman named Ruth Okeke, who had been buying Warren Holt's cider since 1988. Ruth Okeke tasted the 2014 Kingston Black on a Tuesday afternoon in late January of 2020. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How much of this is there?" There was 1 cask, 52 gallons, roughly 624 bottles if he bottled it. "I want 60 cases, she said. He could not give her 60 cases from 1 cask. He gave her 30. He priced them at $22 a bottle, which was the highest he had ever asked for anything in his life. Ruth said the price was low. He did not lower it. Meanwhile, Harlan Voss was making his rounds. This was January 2020, and Voss was still covering the same regional territory he had covered for 15 years, calling on cideries and wineries from Syracuse to Binghamton. He had heard through a distributor contact that the Holt place had not been shuttered after all, that someone was working the casks. He drove back out to Schuyler County in March of that year, this time to a place that had a temporary sign over the cellar door and a truck parked in the barn. Amos met him in the driveway. Voss had his tablet and his ledger and his confident projections. "I understand you're making a go of it," Voss said. He was not unkind. He genuinely believed what he was about to say. "But here's the picture, as I see it. The heritage variety category is crowded now. There are 6 craft cideries in the region with proper cold chain distribution. If you're going to move product at scale, you need consistency. That means a controlled yeast program, a stainless tank setup, filtration. What you're doing with the wild ferment is a nice story, but it's a boutique liability." He paused. He looked at the cellar door. "Sentimental value aside," he said, "you're looking at a 6-figure equipment investment before you can compete." Amos offered him a glass of the 2016 Spitzenberg blend. Voss accepted. He tasted it. He looked at the glass. He tasted it again. "It's interesting," he said. "But interesting doesn't distribute." Amos said he understood. He said, "Thank you for the drive." Voss backed his sedan down the gravel drive and left. That was March of 2020. What came next came for everyone. The pandemic shut the restaurants in April. Ruth Okiki's dining room went dark the second week of that month. With a note, she texted Amos that said simply, "Dining room closed, no timeline." He stood in the cellar the morning after and looked at the row of casks and did the arithmetic that the situation required. 23 casks of maturing cider. No wholesale account. $62,000 in debt at a 4.8% annual rate. The spring bottling he had planned to fund the next quarter's operating costs was now inventory he could not move. He had an orchard coming into leaf. There were 6 craft cideries in the region that Harlan Voss had mentioned, the ones with proper cold chain distribution and controlled yeast programs. 3 of them closed in the first 18 months of the pandemic. 2 more reduced operations significantly. The uniform, equipment-heavy, overhead-heavy model that required steady restaurant and event revenue to cover its debt service did not survive a year without dining rooms and events. The Holt operation had no equipment-based debt, no cold chain infrastructure, no wholesale contracts that could evaporate overnight. What it had was casks in a cellar under a barn, accruing value by doing nothing except continuing to be what they were. The structural shock that Harlan Voss had helped administer, his confident pen click in October of 2019, had assumed a world in which scale and distribution channels were the path to survival. It had not modeled what happened when the distribution channels were the first thing to close. He also had a grandson of Warren Holt's oldest friend, a man named Pete Gruber, who ran a small landscaping operation out of Montour Falls, whose own grandfather had drunk Warren Holt's cider at every harvest dinner he could remember. Pete had been following the news of the cidery's revival through Donna Pruitt, who had told everyone within earshot about the young man working the old casks. Pete called Amos in May and asked if he could help in the orchard. He became the second person to work the Holt place in 7 years. The orchard work that spring and summer was remedial. Amos and Pete pruned the collapsed foxwhelp trees back hard, a technique called renewal pruning that sacrifices 1 or 2 years of production to restore the tree's structure and light penetration, so that subsequent years produce fruit with the tannin concentration the variety is capable of when it is not light-starved. This is a commitment that requires a particular kind of patience. You are cutting away good wood now so that better wood can grow later, and the tree will not show you whether you were right for 2 seasons at minimum. Warren Holt's ledger had notes on renewal pruning in the foxwhelp section from 1981 and again from 1997, each time with a note the following year that the trees had responded and the fruit was sharper and darker than the years preceding. Amos read those notes in the evenings and went back to the trees in the mornings. They thinned the Kingston black row, removing the crossing branches that had grown into one another's light during the years of neglect, opening the canopy to the sky so the fruit could color and concentrate as Kingston black fruit does when it is given room and air. They cleared the ground under the Spitzenberg trees of the sod that had been competing with their roots through the dry years. They replaced 3 fence sections along the north boundary that had been down long enough for deer to have established a habit of crossing there, which had been costing the lower orchard its first drop fruit for several seasons. This work was slow, expensive in time, if not in money, and completely invisible to anyone who did not understand what they were looking at. The cidery did not go under during 2020 because of two things. First, Amos applied for an agricultural exemption that allowed him to sell directly from the farm, and he opened a farm stand window in the barn on weekends through the summer and fall. He built the counter himself from pine boards and set it into the old hay door of the barn's south wall. He put a sign on the county road in his own handwriting. No logo. No label with a font chosen by a designer. Just the name of the place and a few words below it. Estate cider, farm window, Saturdays and Sundays, 9 to 3. He sold whatever he felt ready to sell, which was not much. He priced it honestly and did not discount. Some weeks he sold 8 bottles. Some weeks he sold 20. He talked to everyone who stopped, because that was what the window invited. And he found that the people who pulled off the county road to follow a handwritten sign were not people looking for something cheap. They were people looking for something specific. He explained when asked what wild fermentation was. He explained what Kingston Black meant in a glass. He did not pitch. He described. Second, a food writer named Clay Morrow, who had been driving through the Finger Lakes on a personal trip in July with no particular destination, stopped at the hand-lettered sign on the county road and bought a mixed 3-pack for $24. He spent 20 minutes at the farm window talking with Amos. He wrote later that it was the longest conversation about apples he had ever had, and that he had not wanted it to end. He took the bottles home to Brooklyn and opened the first one that Saturday evening and called a friend who worked in beverage media. Before he had finished the glass, he posted a photograph on a personal blog that had perhaps 400 regular readers. The post was shared into a community of heritage beverage enthusiasts and then into a wider network of people who cared in a very specific and passionate way about fermented things made by hand from things that grew in particular places. This community was not large, but it was concentrated and it communicated. Amos did not fully understand at the time what had happened and did not try to engineer it. By September of 2020, he had a waiting list. He did not have a publicist or a social media presence or a newsletter. He had cider that tasted like a specific valley in a specific October, and he had 29 casks that he was drawing on with care, and he had the ledger telling him what each one was and when it would be ready. He drew from the 2015 French Oak Foxwell blend in November of 2020 and offered it to the waiting list first. He sold 48 cases in 9 days. That autumn, his niece, Cora, arrived. She was 24 years old and had just finished a degree in food science at Cornell, and she came with the frankly stated opinion that her great-uncle Warren had been working from instinct and luck, and that there was a rigorous, modern framework that could improve on what he had done. She sat at the kitchen table the first evening with a notebook and said, "I think we should consider introducing a known Saccharomyces strain alongside the wild ferment. We can retain the character while improving consistency." Amos said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "The consistency is the character." She argued. She was trained to argue this way, and she was not wrong from the framework she had been taught. Her professors at Cornell had studied fermentation science for decades. The controlled yeast approach was reproducible. Its failure modes were understood. Its outcomes were predictable within known parameters. The wild ferment method was, from a food science standpoint, a process operating outside those parameters, which meant that something could go wrong in a way you had not planned for. Cora stayed the winter. She tasted the 2014 Kingston Black that Ruth Okiki had first ordered, drawn from the last of that cask in a plain glass at the kitchen table. She did not say anything for 2 full minutes. Then she put the glass down and said, "That shouldn't be possible." Not as a dismissal, as a precise, technical assessment. What she had tasted violated, in a specific and measurable way, her understanding of what wild fermentation could achieve without intervention. The tannin integration, the acidity curve, the aromatic complexity that she could identify by category but not fully name, none of it matched the fermentation science she had been taught for 4 years at one of the better food science programs in the Northeast. Then she opened the ledger and asked Amos to explain every entry in his great-grandfather's handwriting. She spent 2 weeks doing this, not casually. She sat at the barn table with the ledger and a notebook and a pencil and worked through Warren Holt's 61 pages, the way she had been trained to work through a lab report, entry by entry, correlating his tasting notes against his weather observations and his cask records and his notes on individual tree behavior. She found patterns that Warren had never named because Warren had not needed to name them. He had simply learned them through repetition across 40 years of pressing and drawing and noting and tasting and noting again. She came back to the kitchen table after those 2 weeks and said, "He wasn't guessing. He was tracking." She paused. "The wild culture in this orchard is stable. He was managing a stable culture. It just looks different from outside because he didn't use the vocabulary my professors use. He used his own." She enrolled in a course in traditional fermentation the following spring, a certificate program run by a small organization that taught Old World cider and wine practices to working producers. And she came back to the cidery with a technical vocabulary to layer over what she had already found in Warren's ledger. She built a simple system for monitoring the ambient yeast populations in different sections of the orchard and correlating them with fermentation behavior in the cellar. Warren Holt had done this by taste and memory and the 61 pages of the ledger over the accumulated span of a working life. Cora did it with Petri dishes and a microscope she bought used from a university lab in Binghamton for $430. The conclusions were the same. The method was sound. By the fall of 2021, Amos Holt had pressed 3 full seasons, managed the orchard back to productive health, and had casks maturing from 2019, 2020, and 2021 alongside the older inventory. He had paid down $22,000 of the $62,000 debt. He had not taken outside investment. He had not expanded his production beyond what the 80 acres could honestly give. He had also received, in August of that year, a visit from a woman named Dr. Selma Crane, a sensory scientist from a food and beverage research program at a university in Vermont, who was writing a paper on terroir in American cider. She had driven down from Burlington specifically because of Clay Morrow's blog post and 2 subsequent mentions in a trade journal she received. She arrived in a compact sedan, went to the cellar, and tasted through 6 of the active casks over the course of an afternoon, making notes in a way that Amos recognized from his grandfather's handwriting. Careful, sequential, without judgment until the end. At the end, she sat at the barn table and said, "You understand what you have here?" It was not a question. He said he thought he was starting to. She said, "The microbial community in this orchard is not replicated anywhere else in the Finger Lakes region that I have found. These yeasts are as specific to this site as any I have encountered in 15 years of research." She looked at her notes. "I'm going to need to come back." She did. She came back in October of 2021 with a graduate student. They sampled the orchard air, the apple skins, the cellar walls, and 4 cask samples. Their paper, published the following spring in a peer-reviewed journal of fermentation science, described the Holt cidery as containing a distinct, site-specific wild yeast consortium with measurable influence on the organoleptic profile of the resulting cider, citing the 2014 Kingston Black Cask as an example of extended cask maturation, producing measurable terpene, and ester compounds absent from commercially inoculated control samples. Harlan Voss read that paper. He did not call immediately. He waited until October of 2022. The timing was not accidental. October of 2022 was when the regional press had begun, quietly at first and then with some urgency, noting that Schuyler County Orchards and Cider had already sold its reserve allocation for the year and was drawing its waiting list. Demand had grown beyond what Amos could produce from 80 acres. He had received 4 separate approaches from beverage investors, one with a very clear proposal involving a second facility, a new stainless steel fermentation setup, and commercial yeast to standardize the product for distribution. He declined all 4. Donna Priwitt stopped by the cidery that October and found Amos and Cora and Pete in the cellar, drawing from the 2019, pressing into bottles by hand. The kind of slow, particular work that could not be mechanized without changing what it was. She stood in the doorway watching them and did not say anything about a realistic exit. Harlan Voss came the 3rd week of October, the same month. He drove the same sedan and carried the same tablet. He stood in the tasting room that Amos had finished building in the old dairy parlor, with the original stone floor and the row of casks along the east wall, and he asked if they could talk. Amos poured him a glass of the 2019 Foxwhelp, which had been in the renewed French oak for 3 years and was, by any measure, the finest thing the cidery had produced from Amos's own pressings. Voss held it. He tasted it. He put the glass down with the particular care of someone handling a thing he has underestimated. "I made a mistake," he said. He did not dress it up or qualify it. "I looked at what you had, and I ran my formula on it. The formula was wrong." He asked if Amos would be willing to talk about distribution. Amos said he would listen. He said he would not compromise the process. He said the volume was the volume, set by 80 acres and 41 casks, and the time the cider took, and that was not going to change. Voss said he understood. He made a note on his tablet. He looked at the casks along the wall. "What's in the chestnut ones?" he asked, Cora told him. She opened the ledger to the page where Warren had noted the chestnut barrel's origin in 1979 and what had happened to each filling since. Voss read for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, something that looked like the specific recalibration of a man who has been confident for a long time about the right formula and has just understood that the formula had a variable it never accounted for. The following spring, Voss facilitated a limited allocation through his distribution network to 4 accounts he described as having the right customer base for the product. 36 cases of the 2018 Spitzenberg blend. He had originally asked for 60. Amos said 36 was what he could part with. Voss started to say something about demand and allocation logic, and stopped himself. He had been in the room when Amos described the volume as set by 80 acres and 41 casks, and the time the cider took. He had made a note of it. He did not try to negotiate against it. 36 cases sold out in 4 days. The 4 accounts reported waiting lists of their own. Voss called Amos on the 5th day and said he had never moved heritage cider at that velocity. He asked when the next allocation would be available. Amos said he would have to check the ledger. There was a pause on the line. Then Voss said, "Right," in a tone that was not quite resignation and not quite respect, and was probably something that falls between them, which is where honest recalibration tends to land. Amos said he appreciated the call. That October, the year Cora had been tracking the orchard's yeast populations for 2 full seasons, she sat down with Amos and Pete at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp and showed them a map she had drawn of the orchard, with different zones marked by the microbial character of their ambient populations. She had drawn it on the back of a piece of engineering paper, the zones marked in her own color-coded pencil, each labeled with a shorthand she had developed to describe the dominant yeast families in each area. The Kingston Black Row was its own world, its ambient culture, distinct enough from the rest of the orchard that she thought of it almost as a separate fermentation country. The foxwhelp trees near the stone wall were another. The Spitzenberg slope had a third distinct community, influenced, she suspected, by the stand of old apple seedlings that had grown up outside the orchard's formal boundary along the fence line, untended and unnamed, producing small crabbed fruit that Warren had never pressed but that she now thought might be worth understanding, as a fermentation resource rather than simply a curiosity. She said, Grandpa Warren didn't know what he was managing. He just knew it was worth managing. Amos looked at the map for a long time. Then he said, he knew. The 2025 season was the one that generated the waiting list of 412 names. The cidery had by that point supplied 6 restaurants in the region, all of them having come to Amos rather than the other way around, and none of them having been given terms they did not accept. The reserve ciders, those drawn from the longest maturing casks, sold exclusively from the farm at a price that the estate would have considered impossible in 2019. The 2014 Kingston Black, the last 6 cases of it, had sold at $44 a bottle. Harlan Voss was on the waiting list for the 2021 reserve. He was, by then, not the only regional distributor who had made the drive to Schuyler County, only to be told that the allocation had already been spoken for. 8 of the neighboring farms in the valley had, by 2024, come to Cora asking about the wild ferment method. 3 of them had begun transitioning older orchards back to heritage varieties, working from the genetic inventory that Cora had compiled from the Holt Orchard's seed stock. She had started selling cuttings from the Kingston Black Row, 12 trees that Warren Holt had planted in 1972, from a nursery that had itself sourced the stock from an orchard documented before the Second World War. She sold them at cost. She kept a record of every tree placed and where, so the lineage could be traced. The $62,000 debt had been retired in full by the end of 2023. The farmhouse had been repaired. Pete Gruber was full-time on the property and had brought his son-in-law to help in the orchard during pressing season. The chestnut casks, which Warren Holt had acquired because he believed they would produce something unlike anything in the French or American oak lines, had now held 2 of Amos's own pressings, and what they produced was, as Cora put it with characteristic precision, measurably distinct from the bourbon barrel and French oak lines in ways that would take more than one paper to fully describe. Warren Holt's ledger sat on the shelf in the cellar between the first row of chestnut casks and the door. It was not a museum piece. Cora had added 37 new pages in her own handwriting, smaller and more systematic than her great-grandfather's, but organized around the same calendar and the same rows and the same patient question Warren had always asked. What is this cask doing? And when will it be ready? There is a kind of knowledge that does not transfer through a certification or a formula. It transfers through the hands that worked a particular piece of ground for a particular kind of time, and then through the hands that followed, and then through the hands that followed those. Harlan Voss was not a bad man. He was a man with a formula that measured what it measured, and what it could not measure was 50 years of a wild yeast culture shaping itself to the specific tannins of a Kingston black apple in a valley east of Watkins Glen, curated by one man's patient attention and recorded in 61 pages of handwriting that survived a bankruptcy, a 6-year neglect, and a regional distributor's confident pen click. The formula called those casks unsuitable for distribution. The formula was right about everything it knew how to measure. What it could not measure was what the chestnut barrel held, or what the ledger's last page said, or the specific quality of the October afternoon when Amos Holt drew the first sample from his grandfather's turkey baster and wrote in the back of the ledger 4 words. Tastes like the stone wall smells in October. Dark, tight, long. What endures is what belongs to a place. What belongs to a place cannot be replicated by someone who has never stood in it. The ledger is still being written.